I got to the program in writing in 2008, shortly after Gene. He hired me about a month after he got here. And in 2011, Gene found the funding to start this reading series, which is to say that in a very real way, none of this would be possible without Gene. And I think, as everyone in this room probably knows, we owe Gene a lot. During his time as director of the writing program, he's seen a massive change in the way that we teach writing here at Stony Brook University. The curriculum has expanded considerably, and we now have a writing program with over 100 undergraduates. And that's a really tremendous accomplishment, which Gene should be very proud of. He described his tenure as the director of the writing program as a career achievement, and he would be very right to do so. But while he was overseeing the writing program, Gene was doing something else. He was working on an enormous scholarly project, a biography of Jonathan Swift. And I'll show you the book here. There's another one of these. This is just the beginning. So while Gene was responsible for this sea change and how we teach writing at Stony Brook University, he was also writing an authoritative biography of Jonathan Swift. And I'm not going to say anything about Jonathan Swift, because that would be a little bit like talking about basketball in front of Bill Russell. He's going to all the Swift talk for us. But I think probably most people in this room know a little bit about Swift. They've read Hammond's Proposal or Gulliver's Travels. But I would suspect most people don't know much beyond that. And this is a real opportunity to learn something about the man and his work. Gene has been, without question, the best boss I've had, and he has been a tremendous leader and teacher and colleague here at the university, and I feel very thankful to have spent the last 8 years working with him. Please welcome me, join me rather.
You're welcome.
Professor Gene Hammond.
Whoa. Thank you, Kevin. The fun part about directing the writing program and chairing the English department is putting everybody else to work. So I stood on the side and wrote my book while you all did the work. I'm very grateful that you're here today. I see a lot of my closest friends in the audience. I'm doing something today that I have never done before, and that is read from a book. I thought that's what creative writers did. But I guess a biography is kind of a cross between a scholarly book and a creative writing book. I first met Jonathan Swift when I was a sophomore in college. He was long dead by that time, but I was introduced to him, and immediately I was impressed with how much he made me laugh. I mean, almost every page of almost every work that I read for him, he made me laugh. And so when it came time to decide on my dissertation topic, I thought about Shakespeare, I thought about Charles Dickens, but I decided on Swift. And I've stuck with him the rest of my life. I had intended to write a book on Jonathan Swift's civic humanism, but then I decided that civic humanism, as close as it was to what he was interested in, was partly false, to try to put any kind of a label on him. And I thought, the only way I can not be false is to write a biography. So that's what I finally decided to do. And there probably have been 100 biographies of Jonathan Swift over 275 years. And I wanted it to be the best. So let's see. I think you'll enjoy, there's a lot of Swift in it. So you'll enjoy that part at least. What I'd like to start with is a couple of passages from Swift so that you get a sense of his sense of humor. Here, for example, is a letter of recommendation that he wrote for one of his servants when he was 73 and half senile on January 9th, 1740. Swift was half senile, not the servant. Quote, "The bearer served me the space of 1 year, during which time he was an idler and a drunkard. I then discharged him as such. But how far his having been 5 years at sea may have mended his manners, I leave to the penetration of those who may hereafter choose to employ him." Keep that in mind when you need one. 3 years earlier, on April 16, 1737, Swift, in his role as Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, wrote to William Graham, a Privy Councillor, an MP for Drogheda, and a fact that Swift uses to his advantage, a former student of Swift's friend Thomas Sheridan, a letter requesting payment of rent. Quote, "You hold a lease from me and the chapter of my cathedral. This lease is part of our economy, as we call it. That is to say, it is all applied to the repairs of the cathedral, to the payment of the organist and other church servants. Unfortunately," Swift writes, "you have thought fit to be 2 full years in arrear, and our proctor assures me that he never received one line in answer to his frequent letters for payment of your rent. I can impute this way of delaying to many causes. You have either forgot the lectures of Dr. Sheridan, your master, or you have heard it was an unfashionable thing in a gentleman to pay his just debts, or you are exalted by your great estate, or by your seat on the Irish Privy Council, or perhaps you have been drawn into the association against the clergy, and therefore you very reasonably conclude that their churches, especially cathedrals, should suffer. However, I am sorry that, although Christianity be much out of fashion, there might not be some remainder of pagan virtues such as justice and honor and learning and love of our country left. I often have in another kingdom given advice with good success to younger men than you and of greater titles. If you resent anything I have said, it will much lessen the credit of your understanding, as well as of your regard to common justice." Swift at age 70 resembled a 12th round boxer continuing to get up from the canvas to throw one more punch. The last part is the only part of me that's in there. There's also a letter that he wrote to his neighbor Robert Percival, similar style. In December 1729, 8 years earlier, Swift had an entertaining to us fight with Robert Percival. It wasn't entertaining to him. Swift's principal parishioner in the village of Larricore. On December 11th, Swift wrote to young Percival, "Mr. Daniel Griffin tells me you will pay me no tithes, but stop them on account of an island which I held from your father for 2 shillings per annum. This odd way of dealing among you folks of great estates in land and money, although I have been used to, I cannot well reconcile myself with. It is strange that clergymen have more trouble with 1 or 2 squires and meet with more injustice from them than from 50 farmers." 3 weeks later, on January 3rd, 1730, Swift wrote to Percival several of the best sentences of contempt ever collected in a single letter. Quote, "As to yourself, from the badness of your education against all my advice and endeavors, and from the cast of your nature, as well as another circumstance which I shall not mention, I expected nothing from you that became a gentleman. A man wholly void of education, judgment, or distinction of person has no regard in his insolence but to the passion of fear. And how heartily I wished that to make you show your humility, your quarrel had rather been with a captain of dragoons than the Dean of St. Patrick's. One thing I desire you will be set right in. I do not despise all squires. It is true, I despise the bulk of them. If you send me an answer to this, I shall not read it, but open it before company, and in their presence burn it. I have ordered a copy of this letter to be taken with an intention to print it as a mark of my esteem from you." Swift begins his P.S. Let me add something serious. Once Swift got into a white heat about an issue, he did not care much about the consequences of saying what he wanted to. Nonetheless, in this quarrel, he comes off much the superior of Percival in civility, common sense, and of course, humor. In his last years of a semi-sound mind, Swift published a work that he had been collecting raw material for most of his life. It's called Directions to Servants, which David Noakes has ingeniously called a handbook for domestic guerrilla warfare. Even in our day of few servants, we easily recognize the kinds of situations Swift describes. Here is a sampling. When your master or lady calls a servant by name, if that servant be not in the way, none of you are to answer, for then there will be no end of your drudgery. When you have done a fault, be always pert and insolent, and behave yourself as if you were the injured person. This will immediately put your master or lady off their mettle. Never submit to stir a finger in any business but that for which you were particularly hired. For example, if the groom be drunk or absent, and the butler be ordered to shut the stable door, the answer is ready. And please, Your Honor, I don't understand horses. If you are so often teased to shut the door that you cannot easily forget it, then give the door such a clap as you go out as will shake the whole room and make everything rattle in it, to put your master and lady in mind that you observe their directions. Write your name and your sweetheart's with the smoke of a candle on the roof of the kitchen or the servants' hall to show your learning. Never tell a lie to your master or lady unless you have some hopes that they cannot find it out in less than half an hour. When you dress up your sideboard, set the best glasses as near the edge of the table as you can. When any salt is spilt on the table, do not let it be lost. But when dinner is over, fold up the tablecloth with the salt in it. Then shake the salt out into the salt cellar to serve the next day. You need not wipe your knife to cut bread for the table, because in cutting a slice or two, it will wipe itself. You are the best judge of what acquaintance your lady ought to have, and therefore, if she sends you on a message of compliment or business to a family you do not like, deliver the answer in such a manner as may breed a quarrel between them, not to be reconciled. Never ask leave to go abroad, for then it will always be known that you are absent, and you will be thought an idle, rambling fellow. Whereas if you go out and nobody observes, you have a chance of coming home without being missed. Finally, a couple of examples where Swift's scalpel reverses direction and slices the masters. To the waiting maid, if the Lord's eldest son be a common rake or a fool, and he must be one or the other, avoid him like Satan, for he stands in less awe of a mother than my Lord doth of a wife. And after 10,000 promises, you will get nothing from him but a big belly or a clap, and probably both together. Directions for the porter. If your master be a minister of state, let him be home to none but his pimp, or his chief flatterer, or one of his pensionary writers, or his hired spy, an informer, or his printer in ordinary, or his city solicitor, or his inventor of new funds, or a stock jobber. Okay, that's Swift's sense of humor. First, I'd like to read my introduction about the kind of research that I did to get the book going. On a cool, sunny Saturday, July 16th, 1994, in Glasnevin, a suburb just north of Dublin, where I was trying to find what had become of Delville, Patrick Delaney's 11-acre estate where Swift was often entertained during the 1730s, I stopped at a bridge over the Tolka River, along which I knew the estate had lain, and saw a man in an Irish wool sweater looking down over the bridge into the river, counting, he told me, the trout that were just beginning to return. I interrupted him, as I had so many people in the previous few weeks, to ask for help, in this case to ask whether he had ever heard of a Delville estate or anything now named Delville. He had not, but he introduced himself as Joe Stone, a supervisor for the Irish Telephone Company, and he offered to take me to the neighboring Catholic church where he thought that the sacristan, Frank Corbett, might know. Frank indeed knew a lot about the Delville estate. It had stood on a hill within sight of the Tolka River Bridge where Joe and I had met, and an order of Catholic sisters had bought the Delville property in the 1940s, demolished the home, and built a hospital named Bon Secours. Frank remembered Delville before it was torn down, and that as a child, with his friend Tony O'Doherty, he bought apples grown on the estate at a basement window for a penny apiece. So off we went to Tony's house, just around the corner, where the apple story was confirmed, and a racier story that Tony and Frank had regularly nicked a pip was denied unconvincingly by Frank. As the story was being told and retold, Joe, the trout watcher, was being teased by Frank and by Tony and Tony's family for not knowing these crucial details of their childhoods. For Joe was, they said, only a blow-in. That is to say, he had only lived in Glasnevin, although he was born in nearby Dublin, for 35 years. As I continued my search for houses of other friends of Swift in other parts of Ireland, I met other blow-ins, like Michael Hurley of Baldoyle, who took part of a Saturday afternoon to show me Belcamp, the home of Swift's lifelong friends, the Grattan family, which celebrated in 1994 its centenary as a Catholic school. Michael, an executive at Cadbury's Chocolates and the author of several local histories of Baldoyle, knew everyone in town that we passed, but he told me he was still thought of as a blow-in by some, because although he had been born in Baldoyle, his parents had not. Jonathan Swift, born in 1667 in Dublin, most likely at 7 Hoey's Court in St. Werburgh's Parish, 2 or 3 blocks south of the River Liffey, and a stone's throw from St. Patrick's Cathedral, where at the age of 45 he was appointed dean, was another such Irish blow-in, with a generosity, a love of conversation, and a capacity for friendship, much like those overflowing in Joe, Frank, Tony, and Michael in 1994. Swift's blow-in status resulted from the choice made by his father, also named Jonathan, at age 18 in 1659, to emigrate to Ireland. He was the first of 4 Swift brothers to do so, from his family home in Herefordshire, to try to make a better living than he could have imagined in England in the aftermath of the English Civil Wars. Swift's father's life in Ireland was tragically brief. After serving as a law clerk at the King's Inns in Dublin for 8 years, and being married to a young woman named Abigail Eric for less than 3 years, he died in early 1667, poisoned by mercury he took to cure the itch, 7 or 8 months before his second child, our Jonathan, was born. The wife he left with so much responsibility when he died, 27 when she gave birth to young Jonathan, was another blow-in. Orphaned in Dublin by the age of 23, the daughter of a Church of England minister who had emigrated to Ireland during the 1630s because his Puritan leanings had made him unwelcome in his home parish in Leicestershire. Like his father and like most Church of Ireland Irish of his era, Jonathan Swift, until his mid-40s, i.e. until around 1710, saw Ireland as a land of economic opportunity. He prided himself on the superiority of his Trinity College education to those at the more complacent Oxford and Cambridge. He persuaded Esther Johnson, the young woman he loved, she's the woman on the picture here, which is something I'm absolutely thrilled I found. It's a 1900 painting by an Irish artist named Margaret Dixie, and she did scenes from various literature in the English literary traditions. And when Swift first met the love of his life, she was 9 and he was 21 and he was her tutor. And it could be very creepy, especially nowadays. People always assume the creepy. But this painting, makes nothing but creepy. And I don't think it was creepy. He was genuinely her tutor. And I'll tell you a little bit about their love life later. He persuaded Esther Johnson, the young woman he loved, to resettle in Ireland in 1701. And he delighted in living in Dublin, in Trim, and in the country village of Lyricor during his 30s, as he was starting to make his way in the world. But spending more than half his 20s, 30s, and early 40s in England, he also developed a deep sense of emotional identification with England, and with England's power, people, and political and literary opportunities. Despite that identification, though, and unlike most members of the Church of Ireland of his era, Swift gradually came to understand and to resent England's cynical colonial uses of Ireland, and he repeatedly risked his fortune, his status in the church, his friendships, and even his life to critique that English cynicism. Fully at home neither in Ireland or England, Swift never developed a comforting sense of home. His outsider blow-in status, though, put him in an excellent position to satirize what he saw as the vices of both England and Ireland. He wrote many of his works, A Tale of a Tub, Sentiments of a Church of England Man, The Examiner, The Conduct of the Allies, A Proposal for Giving Badges to Beggars, as an insider, whether in England or in Ireland, to push people to make pragmatic changes to improve their lives, to improve the lives of the people whom he had been blown in among. But his unique anti-colonial satires, The Story of an Injured Lady, A Proposal for the Universal Use of Irish Manufacture, The Drapier's Letters, Gulliver's Travels, A Short View of the State of Ireland, and A Modest Proposal, were written as only a blow-in looking in from the outside could write them. Swift, as a blow-in, was both deeply immersed in the colonial enterprise of the English politicians and deeply aware of the consequences of that enterprise in Ireland. Jonathan Swift is best known now as the author of Gulliver's Travels, a staple of English and world literature courses, and of A Modest Proposal, the most ingeniously ironic and most frequently reprinted 10-page pamphlet in history. Yet the story of his life would make a compelling reading even if he had written neither of these works. Both Gulliver's Travels and A Modest Proposal were afterthoughts, recollections, though certainly not in tranquility, of battles and attitudes that Swift had sustained for many years. Being neither fully English nor fully Irish, Swift's unanchored blow-in status limited his early opportunities for public service. But by dint of indefatigable reading and writing, by the age of 33, he had made himself ready to serve. As chaplain to the second Earl of Berkeley, a Lord Justice of Ireland, he wrote in 1701 a pamphlet, The Contests and Dissensions Between the Nobles and Commons in Athens and Rome, that helped restore the reputations of several Whig cabinet members who had been impeached in 1701 for arranging secret treaties with France. As a rural Church of Ireland vicar in 1706 to 1710, he single-handedly persuaded the English government to return to the Irish Church a tax, the first fruits fund, that had been imposed on the Church by Henry VIII, in Swift's eyes the greatest villain in English history, making money available to rebuild churches and cathedrals in Ireland well into the 19th century. As a party writer in 1710, 1711, in the Examiner and in the Conduct of the Allies, by boldly charging England's popular and successful general, the Duke of Marlborough, with prolonging the war because he had no incentive to end it, Swift made possible the end of England's 13-year war of the Spanish Succession with France. As Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, Swift in 1721 established with his own money an interest-free micro-loan fund, lending between £5 and £10 per person, that gave more than 500 poor Dubliners the means to set up or to continue in trade. In 1724, by publishing several letters purportedly by a Dublin drapier objecting to an English government coinage scheme, Swift led a rare and the first successful protest against the British economic exploitation of Ireland. With his estate, when he died in 1745, he founded a psychiatric hospital, St. Patrick's, which still serves the people of Ireland. And in A Tale of a Tub, his literary masterpiece, written while he was postgraduate private secretary to an ex-diplomat, Sir William Temple, he wrote an intellectual defense of Church of England Protestantism that, were it not for its disconcerting satiric barbs against its own readers, might well have been celebrated ever since as the Protestant aesthetic, moral, political, and poetic equivalent of Dante's Divine Comedy. There have been many biographies of Jonathan Swift, the first by his acquaintance John Boyle, 5th Earl of Orrery, 40 years his junior, in 1751, only 6 years after his death. Swift has been portrayed as a genius, undoubtedly true, by Orrery, as eccentric and amusing, also certainly true, by Letitia Pilkington, as a secular saint, a case easy to make if you're selective in choosing your evidence, by Patrick Delaney, Dean Swift, and Thomas Sheridan, as a good but not particularly distinguished author, a wrong-headed and self-serving portrait by Samuel Johnson, as an isolated malevolent, true in certain moods and only in the last 15 years of his life, by Francis Jeffrey and William Thackeray, as a partisan with little independent conscience. He only served parties, I think, though, when their principles were nearly congruent with his, by Philip Henry Stanhope. And in recent years, as brilliant and admirable, but as an emotional misfit, though the evidence is that Swift was far more often an emotional rock for others than an emotional wreck himself, by Irvin Aaron Price, David Noakes, and Victoria Glendenning. Those are the three biographies I'm really competing with. In this biography, I have taken much from all these rich biographies, but my emphasis, taking the lead, I think, from Swift's own concerns, is neither on Swift as a literary figure, nor on Swift as a party politician, nor on Swift as a disturbed man. The strongest strain I see in Swift's life, in his letters, in his friendships, in his political actions, and in his published writings, is that of civic activist. For a supposedly literary figure, Swift had limited interest in Shakespeare or Dryden or in the history of English poetry or the emerging novel. He had even less interest in literature's ancillary arts like music, painting, and the theater. He knew well the history of English literature. He could quote from many Restoration plays, and he admired his friend Alexander Pope's poetry. But his chief heroes were Thomas More and Brutus for their principled resistance to tyranny, Paolo Sarpi for his independent-minded history of the Council of Trent, and Edward Hyde, Lord Clarendon, for his literate and unsentimental history of the English Civil Wars. Swift's friend Pope felt deeply the injustice when ninnies like Lawrence Eusden or Colley Cibber were chosen for the post of poet laureate, when Pope was clearly the best poet in England. But Swift, though a prolific, inventive, and versatile poet, and a brilliantly metaphoric prose writer, would never have imagined himself as poet laureate. If his career had taken the shape that he had wanted it to, he would have spent his life advising noblemen setting English policy, crowning his career as a bishop or a dean of an English cathedral, while holding at the same time the respectable post of historiographer royal. Swift wanted both to make history and to record it as Plutarch did, so that future generations could learn from it. Swift did not see history as the relation of facts with deference to all possible points of view. He was proud to write with the prejudices, that's his own term, he had acquired from his Church of England religion and from his classical education at Trinity College. Whether in or out of favor with those in power, Swift frequently wrote pamphlets and poetry to try to direct the course of events in his time. But he was also convinced, though he was frequently frustrated in his attempts to publish such work, that a principled rendering of history was the best means to inspire future leaders to similarly principled behavior. Principled behavior, whether in or out of public stations, was what he lived for and why he wrote. I do not share with past biographers the sense that Swift had a deprived childhood. I do not share the suspicion that most of Swift's enmities were politically motivated. I do not feel critical of him because he was often fastidious with his money. I do not think he was insincere about his religious faith. His pride, his sexual interests, his often shocking or uninhibited language, his instinct for revenge, emphasized by many previous biographers, were all fundamental elements of his being, but elements that he either used for rhetorical effect or that he tried to keep in check, and that he felt that religion helped him to keep in check. Swift had as firm a conviction as did Freud that we are born with wayward tendencies. Unlike Freud, though, he saw both religion and civil society as necessary and helpful checks on those wayward tendencies. And he frequently, but certainly not always, acknowledged that he shared those tendencies with the rest of us. This biography, in 2 books, Jonathan Swift, Iris Blow-In, and Jonathan Swift, Our Dean, will differ from most literary biographies in that it does not aim to show how Swift's life illuminates his writings, but rather how and why Swift wrote in order to live the life he wanted to live. This book, I think that's so important to think about, that we usually assume that the writings are more important than the life, and I've tried to do the reverse. This book, Jonathan Swift, Iris Blow-In, traces the tragic arc of Swift's first 47 years, highlighting his brilliant tale of a tub, which, because of the conventional thinking of his readers, hurt more than helped his reputation, and his exceptional service to the Tory ministry of 1710 to 1714, which achieved a crucial peace with France and a stabilization of England's economy, but resulted for Swift only in heartache, frustration, and political and personal exile for the rest of his life. The second book, Jonathan Swift, Our Dean, will show how Swift resiliently rebounded from this tragedy and used his role as Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin, and his ability to identify with working people and even with beggars to become in his later years an eloquent and effective opponent of the imperialism that England took for granted that it had the right to exercise. I have liberally quoted Swift's own words in this biography because his inventive expression of ideas, both in his public works and in his private letters, was what has made him a unique and compelling figure in the history of literature. I hope in these 2 books to come closer than past biographies to capturing how it felt to Swift himself to live his life. Okay, so that's my introduction. I would like to read a little passage about his relationship with Esther Johnson. She was his near constant companion from when she was 21 until she died at age 47. And he met her when he was 22 and she was 9. She was the daughter of a servant of Sir William Temple, and as early as when she was 12 or 13, I think she was Swift's most trusted confidant. I'm going to read a little section about that. Swift left Sir William Temple in 1694 to pursue on his own a career as a clergyman. Swift described the parting in a June 3rd, 1694 letter to his cousin Dean in Portugal. I forgot to tell you I left Sir William Temple a month ago, just as I foretold it to you, and everything happened thereupon exactly as I guessed. He was extreme angry I left him, and yet would not oblige himself any further than upon my good behavior, nor would promise anything firmly to me at all, so that everybody judged I did best to leave him. I design to be ordained September next and make what endeavors I can for something in the church. One wonders who the everybody was that judged I did best to leave him, i.e., who were his confidants at this time. His cousin Thomas Swift was not likely to have been one of them, since he was just stepping into the role of Temple's secretary, and so would be self-serving in advising Swift to leave. Perhaps this everybody consisted of young friends in London, like the playwright William Congreve and other former schoolfellows. But Swift's most likely confidant at this time, though she was only 13, was Esther Johnson. His confidant knew Temple as well as Swift did, and the confidant's loyalty was to Swift. Lady Gifford, ever loyal to her brother, Sir William, would never have sided with Swift if she had to choose. Bridget Johnson, Esther's mother, and other Moore Park employees might have sided with Swift. On balance, though, I think Swift's closest confidant in 1694 was indeed Esther Johnson. The utter trust that Swift and she felt for each other later in life seems to have developed strikingly early, enabling both to get through crises like this one, even in Teddy's very early years, Teddy's nickname for Esther Johnson. A characteristic of Swift that many biographers have emphasized was that he was a hypocrite in reverse. He was made uneasy by the image of practicing good deeds, which he frequently did. So he almost always hid or at least downplayed his good deeds, while at the same time highlighting his rebellious or mischievous activities. Okay, I'm going to skip forward to when Swift got a job with the Tory ministry took over in 1710, and they immediately hired Swift as their leading writer. And this is when he had the most power in his life for the next 4 years, although the ministers behaved so badly that he wound up regretting, perhaps, that he had gotten involved.
Nothing you could identify with.
I told you my dream one time, didn't I? Paradoxically, it is during this, Swift's longest period away from Esther Johnson, or maybe I should say a little bit about that. When she was 21, Swift was living in Ireland, and Esther Johnson was a servant of Sir William Temple, although he had died, so she was a servant of his sister by that time. Swift asked Esther Johnson and her friend Rebecca Dingley to move to Ireland, and they did. And Swift said some people thought this was a little frolic. And then he took care of them. He took half his salary and gave that money to them for the rest of his life. When his salary increased, when he became Dean of St. Patrick's, he doubled their salary, or the money that he gave them. And he never lived with Esther Johnson. They always lived separately. They visited each other almost every day. And so people have speculated on exactly what kind of a relationship it was. But it's very clear that it was very loving. So anyway, there were 4 difficult years from 1710 to 1714 where Esther Johnson stayed in Ireland and Swift was living in England, in London, and working for the government. Paradoxically, it is during this, Swift's longest period away from Esther Johnson, nearly 3 years, that we learn most about their intimate and comfortable relationship. She and Rebecca Dingley saved Swift's letters from 1710 to 13, and Swift in turn saved the letters after Esther's death in 1728. He gave a packet of these letters to his cousin Martha Whiteway for safekeeping in his final years, which she in turn passed on to her son-in-law, Dean Swift. That's confusing because Swift was a dean, but he had a cousin whose name was Dean Swift. Others were saved by Rebecca Dingley. In fact, when I went to Larricore, this small little town in Ireland, and I asked about some question about Swift, and they said, "Oh, he's buried, a couple miles over here." So I went over and looked, and it was actually the grave of his cousin, Dean Swift, with an E. And I knew Swift wasn't buried there, but anyway. So she passed on the letters to her son-in-law, Dean Swift. Others were saved by Rebecca Dingley and then by her executor, Reverend John Lyon. Swift consistently addressed these letters to MD. People think that means my dears, or sometimes MC, mes chéris, I think, or ME, which he also used occasionally, perhaps means mes enfants, my children. He never addressed Esther Johnson in these letters as Stella, the name he used for her in his birthday poems to her after 1719, and in only 3 of his surviving letters during the last 10 years of her life. Dean Swift edited for his 1768 edition the more than half of Swift's 1710-13 letters to Hetty and Rebecca that he received from his mother-in-law, Martha Whiteway, but he edited very unhelpfully, quoting Dean Swift. To avoid perplexing the reader, he noted, it was thought more advisable to use the word presto for Swift. I don't know why he decided that. And he also inserted Stella in place of any term that Swift used for Esther Johnson. The letters Dean Swift used have since been lost, so we cannot check to find the names Swift actually used. Dean Swift titled the letters he published in 1768, Letters from Dr. Swift to Stella. Following Dean's lead, Thomas Sheridan, when in 1784 he published the full set of journal letters that we now have, titled them Dr. Swift's Journal to Stella, the title by which they are still unfortunately known. The letters after February 1712, i.e. the letters that Sheridan had but Dean Swift did not, still survive. And we see in them Swift's frequent use of poppet or saucebox for Esther Johnson. And PDFR, poor dear friend, for himself. I mean, Stella means star, guiding light of my life. But when she was young, he called her saucebox. And I think we should call these letters the Journal to Saucebox. Both Poppet and Saucebox give us a more accurate sense of how Swift felt about Esther Johnson at the time he wrote this journal than does the name Stella, which was one of his names for her in her late 30s and 40s. As Swift was writing to Hetty and Rebecca, he cast many of his comments into the form of conversations with the young women. I'm going to read a few of those. I am rising to go to Jarvis to finish my picture, and 'tis shaving day, so good morrow, my dears, but don't keep me now, for I can't stay. I must not end yet, because I can't say goodnight without losing a line, i.e. wasting a space at the bottom of the letter. And then my dears would scold, but now, good night. So he just added another sentence and then used up the last line. So now to your letter, brave boys. There's another word or phrase that he used for them, brave boys. Why do you trouble yourself, here we get a little saucy. Why do you trouble yourself, Mistress Poppet, about my instrument? I have the same the Archbishop gave me, and it is as good now as it was when the bishops were here. Obviously a play on the idea that a penis is an instrument. After writing of his plan to open my business to Harley was the leading Tory minister, he adds, which expression I would not use if I were a woman. I know you smoked it, but I did not till I read it. Writing with crooked lines, he says, I think I have brought these lines pretty straight again. I think I am civiller than I used to be, and have not used the expression of you in Ireland and we in England, as I did when I was here before, to your great indignation. It bugged them when he did that. Poor my dear's letter was lying so huddled up among papers I could not find it. I don't write as I should, because I am not in bed. See the ugly wide lines. Lord, I dreamt of Poppet last night so confusedly. I won't open it yet. Yes, I will. No, I won't. I'm going. I can't stay till I turn over to the other side of the page. What shall I do? My fingers itch, and I now have it in my left hand, and now I'll open it this very moment. It's a letter that she wrote to him. God Almighty bless dear poor Poppet with her eyes and head. She was having some trouble with her eyes at this point. What shall we do to cure them, poor dear life? Our disorders are a pullback for your good qualities. Would to heaven I were this minute shaving your poor dear head, either here or there. I'm not sure if to get rid of lice or what, but interesting kind of intimacy. My pen is apt to ramble when I think who I am writing to. Insolent sluts. Because I say Dublin, Ireland, therefore you must say London, England. That's Poppet's malice. If you will write, shut your eyes and write just a line and no more. Thus, how do you do, Mrs. Poppet? That was written with my eyes shut. Faith, I think it is better than when they are open. And then Dingley may stand by and tell you when you go too high or too low. I have been scribbling, which is his term for writing for publication this morning. And I believe I shall hardly fill this side today, but send it as it is. And it is good enough for naughty girls that won't write to a body and to a good boy like me. Stop your receipt in your arse. I have no need of it. I wish you could hear me repeating all I have said in its proper tone, just as I am writing it. 'Tis all with the same cadence as, ooh-hoo, or as when little girls say, I've got an apple, miss, and I won't give you some. I ain't sleepy yet. Let's sit up a little longer and talk. Love that one. Okay, in these letters to Esther Johnson, there is a running theme of a lost box of gifts Swift had bought for her and for Rebecca Dingley. There's just one sentence that appears in a bunch of different letters, but I gathered them all together because I think it makes an interesting story. On October 19th, 1710, Swift tried to send a box of presents to Hetty and Rebecca. I have sent a box to Mr. Enoch Stern to send to you by some friends. I have directed it for Mr. Curry at his house, so you have warning when it comes, as I hope it will soon. The handkerchiefs will be put in some friend's pocket, not to pay custom. But the box was ill-fated. Despite numerous efforts and plans, more than a year later, no presents had reached Ireland. On November 26th, Swift wrote, oh, but your box was sent to Dr. Hawkshaw by Stern, and you will have it with Hawkshaw and spectacles. 4 months later, on February 9th, 1711, he apologized. As for the box, I now believe it lost. It is directed for Mr. Curry at his house in Capel Street. I had a letter yesterday from Dr. Raymond in Chester, who says he sent his man everywhere and cannot find it. And God knows whether Mr. Smith will have better success. Stern spoke to him, and I writ to him with a bottle of palsy water. That bottle, I hope, will not miscarry. I long to hear you have it. The same day he had better news. I this minute sent Patrick, that's his servant, to Stern. He brings back word that your box is very safe with one Mr. Earl's sister in Chester, and that Colonel Edgeworth's widow goes for Ireland on Monday next and will receive the box at Chester and deliver it to you safe. So there is some hopes now. On May 17, 1711, it is evident once again that the box was not carried when Swift expected it to be. He wrote to Hetty and Rebecca with stunning frankness. Stern tells me that Mrs. Edgeworth married a fellow in her journey to Chester. So I believe she little thought of anybody's box but her own. On June 30th, 1711, he was hoping against hope. I believe the box is not lost. Stern says it is not. On August 23rd, he was puzzled. You say nothing of the box sent half a year ago. But on October 27th, he accepted responsibility. I hate Stern for his carelessness about it, but it was my fault. This is the only time in his whole life I ever saw Swift say it was my fault. He never admitted he was in the wrong. Finally, on October 30th, he celebrated a minor success. I have sent your apron and the pamphlets to Lee, and will send the miscellanies and spectacles in a day or two. I would send more, but faith, I'm plaguey poor at present. The last we hear is on November 23rd, 1711. Lee has got the apron and things, and promises to call for the box at Chester, but I despair of it. So much for using your friends as your postal service and saving a few shillings on customs duties for handkerchiefs. Okay. I'd like to read a little paragraph that I think illustrates something interesting about Swift. He moved to the suburb of Chelsea of London so he could get more exercise going back and forth while he was living in London. All his life, Swift not only adapted to, but rapidly adopted his surroundings. After less than a month living in Chelsea, just outside London, to save money and to get more exercise, he calls it our town. On May 19th, he wrote to Hetty and Rebecca, do you know that about our town we are mowing already and making hay, and it smells so sweet as we walk through the flowery meads. Like he's lived there all his life. On May 18th, Swift was talking late with his neighbor Francis Atterbury. I sat with Dean Atterbury till 1 o'clock after I came home. After that, I came home. On May 19th in town, Mr. Harley and I sat together where we talked through a great deal of matters I had in mind to settle with him, probably including stepping away from writing the examiners and possibly what he should do next. Lord Rivers conjured me not to walk so late, but I would, because I had no other way, but I had no money to lose. On May 20th, Swift found himself uncomfortable at Henry St. John's house. Mr. Secretary had too much company with him today, so I came away soon after dinner. I give no man liberty to swear or talk bawdy. Of course, he did talk bawdy to Esther Johnson. And I found some of them were in constraint, so I left them to themselves. In the earlier summer of 1711, Swift was very exasperated by a month of scorching hot weather. It was probably 75 or something like that. But I think it's very funny what happened to him in the process. On June 3rd, Swift complained to Hetty and Rebecca about the continuing very hot weather. I think the weather is mad. I could not go to church. Until this time, Swift had only missed church if his dizziness was too great. All his life, he had Meniere's disease, which made him dizzy and had migraine headaches and have deafness that was intermittent. It would come and go. On June 4th, he wrote, the weather is insupportable. On June 5th, he took action. I am cruelly thirsty this hot weather. I am just this minute going to swim. I take Patrick down with me in the evening to hold my nightgown, shirt, and slippers, and borrow a napkin of my landlady for a cap. So farewell till I come up. Up, but there is no danger. Don't be frightened. I have been swimming this half hour and more. And when I was coming out, I dived to make my head and all through wet, like a cold bath. But as I dived, the napkin fell off and is lost, and I have to pay for it. Oh, Faith, the great stones were so sharp I could hardly set my feet on them as I came out. The next day, he wrote, I feel no hurt from last night's swimming. I lie with nothing. They worried about everything in their health in the 18th century. I lie with nothing but the sheet over me, and my feet quite bare. The hot weather was trying his soul. Nothing makes me so excessively peevish as hot weather. That evening, he wrote, I walked home and was here by 10. So miserably hot that I was in as perfect a passion as ever I was in my life at the greatest affront or provocation. Then I sat an hour till I was quite dry and cool enough to go swim, which I did, but with so much vexation that I think I have given it over, for I was every moment disturbed by boats, rot them, and that puppy Patrick, standing ashore, would let them come within a yard or two and then call sneaking to them. I dived to dip my head and held my cap on with both hands for fear of losing it. A striking testament to Swift's true love of company is that we find in all of Swift's records no detailed descriptions of food. When St. John showed him a bill of fare for a dinner he was planning, Swift responded, "Show me a bill of company, for I value not your dinner." I love that. Okay. No biographer up to this point has been willing to say that Swift had a sexual affair with Hesse van Homrij, a woman that he met in London in 1707 when he was 40 and she was 17. He was good at this. Actually, Swift had many, many, many women friends, and all ages. He would, when he was in his 20s, he made friends with grandmothers, and but he also almost always had some teenage young women who were very fond of him, and he was fond of them. And I don't think there was anything sexual involved, although there was definitely a power dynamic going on.
What was this woman's last name again?
Van Homrij? There are two Esthers in Swift's life, and they're both named Esther. She was a son of a Dutch merchant. Many of the Dutch Protestants left because the French and the Spanish were so tyrannical with their Catholicism, and they came to England. And so her father was a Dublin merchant. But she wound up in England. Very complicated life. Very interesting story. And a lot of their letters to each other survive. He met Esther van Homrij in London in 1707 when he was 40 and she was 17, and she pursued him to Ireland in 1714 and until her death in 1723 when she was 33. So she died at 33 of tuberculosis.
Was that the same year as...
Stella died?
Yeah.
No, she died about 5 years later.
Okay.
So, and in fact, during that 5 years, he really repaired his relationship with Stella, I think, after the Esther van Homrij died. Biographers claim that Swift was impotent, or that his role as clergyman prevented him from considering sex, or that his love for Esther Johnson was too pure for him to consider sleeping with Esther van Homrij. All those would be nice if they were true, but they weren't, I don't think. I think, though, that the evidence is overwhelming that they did, and this may prove to be the most controversial aspect of my biography. I'm hoping that it gets attention, actually. Paradoxically, or at least it may at first seem so, well, actually, I'm going to skip over this. In 17, they wrote a lot of letters to each other, and most of the time, she is begging for his attention, and he's keeping her at arm's length. But in 1719, suddenly, he writes her a letter in French that is full of glowing compliments to her. And I think that that's an indication that something had happened in their relationship. Whatever we might infer from this single 1719 letter, though, there is a great deal of evidence in the many letters Swift and Hesse wrote to each other in the 3 following years from 1719 to 1722 that their relationship in 1719 had become sexual. In one of Swift's 1722 letters, he describes a daydream to Hesse. Quote, "I see you this moment as you are visible at 10 in the morning, and now you are asking your questions round, and I am answering them with a great deal of affected delays. And the same scene has passed 40 times, as well as the other from 2 till 7. Longer than the first by 2 hours, yet each has its particular pleasures." In a second letter written from Clower in the midst of a 1722 trip in the country, Swift writes that because of the bad weather he has endured on his trip, quote, "it would have been infinitely better once a week to have met Kendall and so forth, where one might pass 3 or 4 hours in drinking coffee in the morning, or dining tete-a-tete, or drinking coffee again until 7. Dennis Johnston has collected a few of the many passages from Swift's letters to Esther van Homrij between 1720 and 1722, in which he writes about drinking coffee with her. Here are 4 quotations. "I wish I were to walk with you 50 times about your garden, and then drink your coffee. Without health, you will lose all desire of drinking your coffee. I can say no more, being called away, but be assured that no one in the world has been more admired, esteemed, and adored by your friend than you are. I drank no coffee since I have left you, nor intend till I see you again. There is none worth drinking but yours, if myself may be the judge." Third passage, "Remember that riches are 9 parts in 10 of all that is good in life, and health is the 10th. Drinking coffee comes long after, and yet it is the 11th, but without the 2 former you cannot drink it right." Fourth, "The best maxim I know in this life is to drink your coffee when you can, and when you cannot, to be easy without it. Thus much I sympathize with you, that I am not cheerful enough to write, for I believe coffee once a week is necessary to that." After quoting these 4 passages, Johnson comments, "Perhaps opinions may differ as to what precisely Swift is referring to, but whatever it is, one must surely be a little naive to believe that it is a beverage." Swift was seldom an Epicurean in any sense of the term. If drinking coffee was not for him a metaphor, or more precisely a metonym, by association for sex, it at least sounds Epicurean every time he uses the phrase. No metonymical references to drinking coffee appear in any of the surviving letters between Swift and Esther van Homrij during their early acquaintance up through 1715. It is probable, therefore, that Swift and Hesse converted their fascination for one another into a sexual one sometime after 1715, most probably in early 1719, in the months leading up to Swift's writing her his French letter, since the rapture in that letter has the feel of being newfound. Swift's frequent references to coffee in his letters to Hesse are the most puzzling aspect of them, and the aspect whose interpretation has had the greatest effect on the portrait of Swift that we live with. In none of Swift's letters does he explicitly express any sexual desire for Esther van Homrij. He may, as most biographers and critics have concluded thus far, have used coffee simply as a metonym for their talk with each other, or for time spent alone together. But whatever coffee meant, I don't think so. But whatever coffee meant to Swift and Hesse, they both seem to have enjoyed it. And Swift, if not Hesse, clearly could take this coffee or leave it. There is no evidence that Swift suffered any guilt about taking coffee with Hesse, but there is no evidence that he suffered any guilt about anything he did in his life. His sense of duty was strong, but he never uttered a word of regret about any professional or personal decision that he made. Hesse's letters to Swift are even more convincing than Swift's that they were sexual lovers. I'll just quote 2 sentences. 1, we have had a vast deal of thunder and lightning. Where do you... well, Hesse writes her letters, there's no punctuation in them from start to finish, you know. And her whole personality seems to fit that style. We've had a vast deal of thunder and lightning. Where do you think I wished to be then? And do you think that was the only time I wished so since I saw you? Here's the second one, even better. Put my passion under the utmost restraint and send me as distant from you as the earth will allow. Yet you cannot banish those charming ideas which will ever stick by me whilst I have the use of memory. Nor is the love I bear you only seated in my soul, for there is not a single atom of my frame that is not blended with it. Therefore, don't flatter yourself that separation will ever change my sentiments. What has prevented readers of Swift from accepting that sex between Swift and Hesse van Homrij was likely is the desire of most who have read and commented on Swift to protect and honor Esther Johnson. But Esther Johnson does not need our protection. She worked out her own peace with Swift. If we are to be honest about Swift, we need to shake off this desire to protect her. Dean Swift, when he published Swift's 1710-13 letters to Esther Johnson, attempted to make her into a lifelong Stella by naming those letters A Journal to Stella. But we need to remind ourselves that Esther Johnson was a woman and not, except for a handful of poems or a couple of letters, a Stella. What time is it? 5:02? Okay. I wanted to read my interpretation of the end of Gulliver's Travels, but I'm going to skip that and stick with the more human things. Just a few short passages toward the end of Swift's life. Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels in 1726 and Modest Proposal in 1729. And he was probably angriest with the world in 1729 when he wrote A Modest Proposal. So here's what I wrote after talking about Modest Proposal. It is intriguing to give some thought to what Swift's reputation would have been if he had died in political, economic, and moral despair at the age of 62 between October and Christmas 1729, just after publishing A Modest Proposal. He would then and forever have been perceived as the supreme romantic, the lover of his Vanessa, the restrained and noble friend of his Stella, the brilliant author of Gulliver's Travels, who summed up his thoughts on our behavior and our predicament in A Modest Proposal, and then left us to do something about it. Swift's reputation, like Wordsworth's, has suffered as Swift himself did, but from his living on. But though his literary career had completed its most perfect arc with the completion of Modest Proposal, Swift deserves not a diminished reputation, but admiration for what he did in the years that he lived after A Modest Proposal. From 1729 until he was declared incompetent in 1742, he continued to fight for liberty and for many other causes he saw as serving the public good, without gaining much satisfaction that his ideas were being taken seriously, and getting pleasure from living only when he could forget his situation and simply enjoy the people he was with. Okay, here's a funny passage. Swift and his friends decided to set up a Saturnalia. which is where the servants take the role of the masters and the masters the servants. Swift's tendency to intolerant outbursts is evident again when he and his friends planned the Saturnalia for the deanery, giving servants the liberty to take their masters' places for a day as their masters took the role of servants. As the holiday played out, Swift was not as pleased with reversing power roles as he had been as a young man when he consistently held the posts of lesser power. Mrs. Pilkington reports, quote, "The first time they put this scheme into practice was at the deanery house, when all the servants were seated and every gentleman placed behind his own man. The dean's servant took an opportunity of finding fault with some meat that was not done to his taste, and taking it up in his hand, he threw it in his master's face, and mimicked him in every other foible which he had ever discovered in him. At this, the dean flew into a violent rage, beat the fellow, and put everything in such disorder that the servants, affrighted, fled the room, and here ended the feast of Saturnalia." English privilege and war thefts. I think there's some strikingly modern thoughts of Swift. Swift articulated in 1734 the idea of English privilege, analogous to that of white privilege that we have come to understand today. On August 30th, he wrote to his good friend, the Earl of Oxford, living comfortably in England, that he must shoulder some of the blame for the troubles in Ireland, even if he has not consciously exploited Ireland. Swift lists several problems plaguing Ireland and asks, quote, "But what is all this to your lordship or to England? It is a great deal to the latter, for your wealth is completed by your tyranny and oppression here. Pardon all this impertinence, my good lord." Swift was great at writing to his friends and trying to make them live up to political principles. He was not afraid to do that. The next day, Swift took on what we now call the war thefts issues, asking the wealthy Duke of Chandos, quote, "to make a present of those ancient Irish records in paper of parchment which relate to this kingdom, that were formerly collected, as we have heard, by the late Earl of Clarendon during his government here, and are now in your grace's possession. They can be of no use in England, and they naturally belong to this poor kingdom." Swift wrote 30 pamphlets in the last 10 years of a whole mind, almost all of which took on an English attempt to wrest more control from the Irish, and a surprising number of which led to a vote in the Irish Parliament or the Dublin City Council favoring the position that Swift took. Almost every time he intervened, he won. Swift's younger friend, Lord Bathurst, wrote in response to people who complained that Swift was no longer writing major literary works, but was focusing on local political pamphlets. Bathurst wrote, "Pray, what is there in your pamphlets but having the knack of hitting the passions of mankind, and a little knowledge of ancient and modern history, and seeing a little further into the inside of things than the generality of men?" I like that summary of so-called lesser works. Okay, and then I will Swift wrote a great epitaph for himself, but I'll skip that, and finish with his obituary. Swift was declared mentally incompetent 3 years before he died, and then was essentially had Alzheimer's for the last 3 years of his life. Swift's obituary notice in the October 22nd, 1745 Dublin Journal, on the front page, but brief and inconspicuous, read that he was born in the parish of St. Werburgh's, Dublin, in the 30th of November 1667, at his uncle, Councillor Godwin Swift's house in Hoey's Alley, which in those times was the general residence of the chief lawyers. His genius, works, learning, and charity are universally admired. The novelist Henry Fielding joined many others in writing a tribute to Swift upon his death. Since the spirit of A Tale of a Tub and of the Scribblers Club infused Fielding's brilliant career, his final words about Swift make an appropriate epitaph to place alongside Swift's own. Here's Fielding's. "A few days since died in Ireland Dr. Jonathan Swift, Dean of St. Patrick's in Dublin, a genius who deserves to be ranked among the first whom the world ever saw. He possessed the talents of a Lucian, a Rabelais, and a Cervantes, and in his works exceeded them all. He employed his wit to the noblest purposes, in ridiculing as well superstition and religion as infidelity, and several errors and immoralities which sprung up from time to time in his age. And lastly, in the defense of his country against several pernicious schemes of wicked politicians. Nor was he only a genius and a patriot. He was in private life a good and charitable man, and frequently lent sums of money without interest to the poor and industrious." And here's my last paragraph. As Dean of St. Patrick's, Swift was easily and capably replaced, first in 1745 by a good man, Gabriel Maturin, Dean of Kildare, and then on Maturin's death in 1747 by the equally good Francis Corbett, a member of Swift's chapter and one of his executors, whose allegiance to Swift is fully evident in the very large handwriting in his manuscript book of sermons still on display in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Swift advised clergymen to write in very large handwriting so that they could look up and see their parishioners. As a kind man, as an ingenious writer, and a man repeatedly willing to risk all he had to fight for the humane uses of power, though, Jonathan Swift, for all his obvious and significant flaws, will never be replaced. Fortunately, he has left us enough letters, drafts, and thoughtful published works to keep us busy for centuries to come, trying to live up to the standards he believed we should live by. That's it.
I want to invite you all to have coffee and dessert, and I'm sure Gene will stick around for the remainder of campus life to answer any questions you might have.
Great. The book was too long, so the talk was too long, too.